Before we begin today's story, a quick friendly request. If you enjoy dramatic true-style HOA and Karen stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more neighborhood battles, satisfying revenge, and justice served in the most unexpected ways. Now, let's dive into this incredible tale. The moving truck rumbled down the manicured street of Willow Creek Estates just after sunrise. It was the kind of suburban neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside. Trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, and streets so clean they seemed vacuumed instead of swept. To an outsider, it might have looked like the dream community. But beneath the surface, whispers of strict rules, endless citations, and a president who wielded power like a weapon filled the air. Michael Jennings, a 42-year-old veteran turned small business owner, had no idea what storm he was driving into when he purchased the last house on the cul-de-sac. For him, the property represented peace and fresh beginnings. After years of service overseas and a messy divorce that left him drained, he wanted nothing more than quiet mornings, a small backyard garden, and the freedom to tinker with his motorcycles in the garage. The house itself wasn't remarkable. A two-story colonial with fading shutters and a yard that had seen better days, it had been on the market for months. Its previous owners had left abruptly, eager to escape what they vaguely described as neighborhood tensions. Michael brushed that off as typical real estate talk. Every neighborhood had its politics, but he figured he could keep his head down, pay his dues, and be left alone. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. He unpacked boxes, set up his tools in the garage, and even waved politely to a few neighbors walking their dogs. But lurking behind those smiles was a presence that had been waiting for him from the moment the moving truck rolled in: the HOA president, Patricia Lane. Patricia was infamous in Willow Creek Estates. Sharp suits, sharper heels, and a voice that could cut through concrete, she had ruled the HOA board for 6 years without challenge. Residents described her as a perfectionist, but in truth, she was a tyrant cloaked in bylaws. Every blade of grass, every fence post, every recycling bin had to meet her standards, or else. She noticed Michael's moving truck before it even backed into the driveway. She noted the rust on the trailer hitch, the faint oil stains on the pavement, and the loud motorcycles strapped to the bed. In her mind, she didn't see a veteran looking for peace. She saw a threat to the image of her kingdom. The first notice arrived before Michael had even finished unpacking. A bright yellow slip tucked neatly under his front doormat: "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates." Reminder: all vehicles must be parked in garages overnight. Motorcycles are prohibited from being stored in visible areas. Michael blinked at it, confused. His motorcycles were in his garage. The notice didn't even apply to him. But the signature at the bottom, Patricia Lane, HOA president, made it clear this was no friendly reminder. It was a warning. Michael shrugged it off. Bureaucracy had been part of his life for decades, and one piece of paper wasn't going to ruin his day. He recycled the notice and went back to unpacking. But Patricia wasn't the kind of woman to be ignored. Within a week, a second notice arrived. This time, it claimed his trash cans had been left out for too long. He checked the timestamp on his security camera. He'd pulled them in less than 20 minutes after collection. Still, the fine of $50 stood printed at the bottom. When Michael called the HOA office, he was met with a calm, almost smug secretary who informed him that all fines are final unless appealed in writing with supporting evidence. It was his first taste of the system Patricia had built, one designed not to serve residents, but to intimidate them. Michael's instinct was to let it go, pay the fine, and avoid conflict. But something about Patricia's tone, and the way neighbors avoided his eyes when he walked down the street, set off a quiet alarm inside him. This wasn't just a random fine. It was the beginning of something bigger. As the weeks passed, Patricia's scrutiny intensified. Michael's lawn, though neatly trimmed, was deemed uneven. His garage lights, energy-efficient LEDs, were called too harsh for neighborhood aesthetics. Even his American flag, proudly hung on the front porch, was cited for being improperly illuminated at night. Each notice came with a fine. Each fine came with a subtle reminder that Patricia was watching. And though Michael tried to keep his temper under control, he felt the slow burn of frustration building with every envelope in his mailbox. But Patricia wasn't content with paper violations. She began walking by his property at odd hours, phone in hand, snapping pictures of his driveway, his garage, even the tools neatly hung on his pegboard inside. She presented herself as protecting community values, but in truth, she was stalking her new neighbor. Michael's breaking point came one Saturday morning. He was in the backyard, planting tomato seedlings in raised beds, when he noticed Patricia standing across the fence line. Clipboard in hand, she was scribbling furiously while glaring at his modest garden. Later that day, a new violation appeared, unauthorized structural modification to backyard area. Fine. $150. The garden bed wasn't against any rule he'd read. It was a simple wooden frame filled with soil. But Patricia had created her own interpretation of the bylaws, one flexible enough to punish anyone she wanted. Neighbors began whispering. Some offered sympathetic smiles, but most kept their distance. They had seen this pattern before. Patricia targeted new homeowners, burying them in citations until they either fell in line or sold their homes at a loss. 3 families in the past 2 years had left under the weight of her harassment. Rumor had it Patricia even collected commissions from some of the resales through her connections in real estate. Michael didn't know all the details yet, but he sensed the truth. Patricia wasn't just enforcing rules. She was running a racket. By the end of his first month in Willow Creek Estates, Michael had collected $450 in fines, half of them baseless. He spent evenings combing through the HOA's bylaws, highlighting passages, and cross-referencing them against his violations. What he discovered left him stunned. Patricia had been bending, twisting, and outright inventing interpretations of the rules. And most residents were too afraid, or too tired, to fight back. As he closed the binder one night, a thought hit him with the force of a hammer. Patricia might control the HOA, but she didn't control him. He had faced worse enemies than a woman with a clipboard and a power complex. From that moment, Michael's perspective shifted. He wasn't just a homeowner under siege. He was a soldier preparing for a new kind of battle. The war for his peace, his home, and his dignity had officially begun. And Patricia Lane had no idea what kind of opponent she had just made. Michael spent the next few days quietly preparing. He knew better than to charge into battle without reconnaissance. His years in service had drilled into him the value of patience, observation, and precision. And though this battlefield was suburban lawns instead of foreign soil, the strategy remained the same: learn your enemy before striking. Every evening after work, Michael walked the neighborhood. He studied the placement of security cameras on corner houses, noted which neighbors kept their blinds shut, and which ones peeked nervously when Patricia's white SUV rolled down the street. He noticed that Patricia's patrols weren't random. She made her rounds like clockwork, 6:30 a.m. sharp, again at noon, and once more after sunset. Each time, clipboard in hand, phone at the ready. The pattern was unnerving, but also revealing. Patricia thrived on intimidation. The more visible she was, the more power she felt she had. And the neighborhood, weary of her wrath, had learned to stay silent. But silence wasn't in Michael's nature. The first counterattack came in the form of documentation. He installed 4 discrete cameras on his property, 2 in the front, 1 at the garage, and 1 overseeing the backyard garden. All fed directly to cloud storage, immune to tampering. If Patricia wanted to build her case with photos, Michael would do the same, but his evidence would carry timestamps, angles, and unedited truth. The very next week, his cameras caught her lingering at his driveway, snapping pictures of his motorcycle through the open garage door. Later that day, another violation arrived: unauthorized storage of recreational vehicles. Fine. $200. But this time, Michael didn't toss the notice aside. He printed the footage, highlighted the timestamp, and attached the HOA's own bylaw clearly stating motorcycles were not prohibited if stored within the garage. He mailed the appeal with meticulous organization, copying both the HOA board and the county clerk's office. Patricia had expected another easy victory, another fine paid without question. Instead, she received a packet of evidence so thorough it left no room for argument. When the board met that month, the violation was dismissed. It was a small win, but word spread quickly. Neighbors began stopping Michael on his evening walks, quietly thanking him for pushing back. Some confessed their own frustrations. One woman whispered that Patricia had fined her for unsightly curtains. Another admitted he'd sold his son's basketball hoop after repeated threats of legal action. Each story painted the same picture: a president who ruled through fear and manipulation. Michael listened carefully, storing every detail. The pattern was clear. Patricia wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was selectively targeting homeowners, escalating pressure until they either submitted or fled. And behind her crusade for community standards, there was a darker motive. Several families who left had sold their homes far below market value. And curiously, Each property had been purchased through the same real estate agent, Patricia's cousin. The racket was obvious now. Patricia manufactured pressure, devalued homes, and funneled sales to her connections. It wasn't just harassment, it was profit. Michael knew exposing her scheme would take time. He couldn't simply accuse her. He needed irrefutable evidence. But in the meantime, he could defend himself and weaken her grip. The second counterattack came at the next HOA meeting. Patricia presided at the long table, flanked by two loyal board members who nodded at her every word. She rattled through the agenda with rehearsed authority until Michael raised his hand. He didn't argue. He didn't rant. Instead, he calmly requested that all violation notices be accompanied by photographic evidence, as required by Section 3.4 of the bylaws, a section Patricia had conveniently ignored for years. He read the clause aloud, holding the binder high for all to see. Murmurs spread across the room. For the first time, Patricia faltered. Her icy smile didn't crack, but her eyes narrowed. She dismissed the request with a wave, promising to review procedures. But Michael had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the residents. If one man could stand up and quote the bylaws, what else might she be hiding? The following week, the pressure escalated. 3 violation notices arrived in a single day: oil stains on the driveway, improper lawn edging, and excessive garage noise. It was an obvious retaliation, a barrage of paperwork designed to bury Michael in stress. But this time, he was ready. The driveway was spotless, documented with fresh photos. The lawn was trimmed to regulation height, measured to the inch. And the garage noise accusation? His cameras showed Patricia standing outside with a stopwatch, timing his use of a power tool in the early evening, well within legal hours. Michael filed a formal complaint, attaching the footage, timestamps, and copies of the bylaws. He submitted everything not only to the HOA but also to the County Housing Authority. Patricia had crossed into harassment, and he wanted a record established. By now, neighbors had begun to notice the cracks forming in Patricia's authority. Some even reached out privately, asking for advice on contesting their own fines. Michael shared his documentation methods freely, encouraging them to record, photograph, and keep every piece of paper. For the first time, residents felt empowered to resist. Patricia, however, sensed her grip slipping. Her patrols grew more aggressive. She lingered longer outside homes, scribbled notes with furious energy, and made veiled comments about maintaining order during casual encounters. But beneath her polished exterior, a quiet desperation simmered. The turning point came one Saturday morning. Michael awoke to find a scattering of roofing nails spread across his driveway, positioned precisely where his truck's tires would roll. He reviewed the camera footage, and though the figure wore a hood, the gait, the stride, and the mannerisms were unmistakable. It was Patricia. Michael didn't rush to confront her. Instead, he quietly documented everything, collected the nails in a plastic evidence bag, and filed a police report. The officers who arrived treated the matter seriously. Tampering with private property was no longer an HOA issue. It was a crime. Word of the police visit spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispered across lawns, and exchanged knowing looks. For the first time, the queen of the HOA appeared vulnerable. But Michael knew this was only the beginning. Patricia wasn't the kind of person to retreat quietly. She would double down, escalate, and lash out harder than ever. And if her racket truly extended into real estate fraud, she wouldn't risk exposure without a fight. As Michael filed away the police report and reviewed the footage once more, he realized the battle lines had shifted. This wasn't just about his peace of mind anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood. Patricia had ruled unchecked for years. But now, she had an opponent who wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, and wouldn't back down. And as the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, Michael prepared for the next phase of the war, a phase where defense would give way to offense. By the 3rd month of living in Willow Creek Estates, Michael had gone from quiet newcomer to the name on everyone's lips. Some whispered admiration, others whispered fear, but all watched carefully. Patricia's once unchallenged reign was beginning to show cracks, and the sight of police at her doorstep had shaken the illusion of untouchable power she cultivated for years. Michael, however, didn't revel in the attention. He stayed focused, knowing the war was far from over. Each day brought new signs of Patricia's desperation. Her SUV slowed conspicuously near his driveway, her clipboard scribbles growing longer and more frantic. Yet the more she tried to trap him, the more her own behavior revealed her obsession. The neighborhood itself seemed to be waking from a long slumber. Residents who had lived in silence began sharing stories. Over coffee at the local diner, a retired couple confessed that they'd paid over $2,000 in fines for minor landscaping disputes Patricia had invented. A young family admitted their home had been targeted so aggressively they'd nearly sold, until Michael's pushback gave them courage to hold on. Piece by piece, the picture became clear. Patricia's pattern was systematic. She singled out households one at a time, overwhelming them with notices until they either complied or fled. Those who sold often did so below value, and curiously, the buyers always seemed to connect back to Patricia's cousin's real estate firm. Michael began compiling these testimonies. He organized them into folders, cross-referenced with dates, violation types, and property sales records pulled from public archives. It was painstaking work, but it revealed an unmistakable trend. Patricia wasn't just overzealous. She was running a calculated scheme to depress home values and funnel sales through her family's business. The scheme had gone undetected because no one dared fight her. Until now. Patricia, sensing her grip loosening, escalated further. Anonymous letters began appearing in Michael's mailbox, typed notes on plain white paper, accusing him of being a disruptive element and warning that some people don't belong here. The tone was unmistakably hers, though unsigned. Michael saved each one, catalogued them, and added them to his growing file. Then came the insurance complaint. Out of nowhere, Michael received a letter from his homeowner's insurance provider, alerting him to a report of hazardous activity in his garage. According to the complaint, he was operating an unlicensed repair business that posed a fire risk. Michael invited the inspector in, confident in his spotless setup. The man walked through the garage, noting the neatly organized tools, the absence of chemicals, the compliance with every safety standard. By the end of the visit, the inspector shook his head. The complaint was baseless, clearly malicious. Michael knew exactly who was behind it. Patricia had broadened the battlefield, moving beyond HOA citations to personal sabotage. But each attempt left a paper trail, and each paper trail made her weaker. Neighbors noticed the shift too. The constant stream of violation notices had once seemed inevitable, but now, with Michael's documentation and defiance, they began to look illegitimate. People started questioning fines, asking for evidence, even appealing decisions. Patricia, once a dictator whose word was law, found herself drowning in resistance. The real breaking point came at the next HOA meeting. Attendance, usually sparse, had swelled to nearly double. Residents filled folding chairs, whispering among themselves as Patricia took her usual place at the head of the table. Her voice carried the same sharp edge, but her eyes flickered with unease. Michael didn't raise his hand this time. Instead, he quietly passed out copies of a summary he had compiled, anonymized testimonies, dates of fines, and evidence of questionable property sales. The murmurs grew louder as neighbors flipped through the pages. Patricia tried to regain control, dismissing the documents as misinformation, but the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted, not just against her authority, but against her honesty. That night, Patricia stormed past Michael's house, phone pressed to her ear, pacing with furious steps. His cameras recorded the entire spectacle, the HOA president unraveling in plain view. Michael knew she wouldn't retreat. She was too invested, too desperate. What he didn't yet know was just how deep her financial troubles ran, or how far she was willing to go to protect her crumbling empire. 2 weeks later, the answer arrived in the form of shattered glass. Michael awoke to find his truck's windshield smashed, shards glittering across the driveway. His cameras had captured the culprit in grainy clarity, a hooded figure with Patricia's unmistakable stride. This time, the police didn't just take notes. They added the vandalism to the growing file, citing her escalating harassment as a clear criminal pattern. The officer's words were firm: "Keep documenting. This is building into something serious." And Michael knew it was only a matter of time before the weight of her actions tipped into full collapse. But as Patricia spiraled, another force was stirring in the neighborhood. A quiet coalition was forming, residents who had suffered under her reign and were ready to fight back. They had evidence, they had grievances, and now, with Michael leading by example, they had courage. The stage was set for a confrontation that would go far beyond fines and citations. It would expose not just a tyrant, but a fraud who had built her power on lies and fear. And for the first time in years, Willow Creek Estates began to imagine a future without Patricia Lane. The vandalism incident was a turning point, not just for Michael but for the entire neighborhood. Until that moment, Patricia's reign of citations and intimidation had been treated as an unfortunate fact of life, something everyone hated but no one dared challenge. The smashed windshield changed that. It wasn't just about fines anymore. It was criminal, undeniable, and captured on video. When neighbors saw the police cruiser parked outside Michael's home, curiosity turned into whispers, whispers into conversations, and conversations into something stronger. By the following week, a handful of residents quietly gathered in Michael's garage. It was the first time many of them had openly discussed their shared experiences. There was Helen, who had been fined $500 for a non-conforming fence despite a structure matching the HOA's own specifications. There was David, a single father, who revealed that Patricia had cited him for excessive noise every time his children played basketball in the driveway. And there was Marisol, who showed Michael a folder thick with violation letters ranging from lawn length to mailbox paint, each one chipping away at her savings until she nearly lost her home. As each story unfolded, Michael organized them. His military background made him meticulous, and soon, a wall of evidence began forming in his garage. Printouts, violation letters, public sale records, and testimonies pinned neatly in rows. It looked less like a homeowner's grievance board and more like an investigation into organized crime. What emerged was damning. Properties that had been targeted most aggressively were the ones that sold quickest, and always below market value. And almost every single one had been processed through Patricia's cousin's real estate office. The pattern was undeniable, the motive clear. Patricia wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was exploiting it. The coalition grew. Each week, more residents joined, bringing files, photos, and memories they had been too afraid to share before. The quiet murmur of dissent swelled into a chorus. For the first time, Patricia wasn't the one dictating the narrative. But Michael knew evidence alone wasn't enough. Patricia had allies, board members loyal to her out of fear or convenience, and a handful of residents who believed her promises about preserving property values. To dismantle her grip, the coalition needed strategy. They began with documentation. Every member of the group installed cameras, saving footage to shared cloud accounts. They standardized incident reports, noting dates, times, and witnesses for every interaction with Patricia. What had once been isolated complaints now became a coordinated archive of harassment and fraud. Next came research. Michael and Marisol dug into county records, uncovering financial filings for the HOA. Buried among the numbers were questionable expenditures, thousands paid to consulting firms with vague names, landscaping projects that never materialized, and legal fees that seemed to benefit Patricia more than the community. The coalition's suspicions were confirmed. Patricia wasn't just bending the rules for profit. She was siphoning HOA funds directly into her own pocket. Meanwhile, Patricia doubled down. She issued new violation letters at a furious pace, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single day. She accused Michael of running an illegal business, Marisol of violating architectural harmony with her flower garden, and Helen of deteriorating curb appeal because of a minor crack in her driveway. Each accusation was baseless, but each one was designed to overwhelm. Her tactics extended online. A new neighborhood watch group appeared on social media, run by Patricia herself. Under the guise of community safety, she posted photos of Michael's garage, David's basketball hoop, and even Helen's backyard, framing them as threats to property values. At first, a few loyalists echoed her complaints. But when she began deleting dissenting comments, the group splintered. Neighbors who once stayed quiet grew louder, calling her out for censorship and manipulation. The narrative was shifting. Patricia's control, once absolute, was slipping through her fingers. The breaking point came during an emergency HOA board meeting. Patricia, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, announced a new bylaw proposal, an immediate ban on all mechanical repair activities within the neighborhood. Violations would carry $500 fines per incident. It was a direct attack on Michael, thinly veiled as a community measure. But this time, the residents were ready. Dozens of them showed up, many for the first time, clutching copies of the bylaws and evidence compiled by the coalition. When Patricia attempted to push the measure through, Michael calmly cited the clauses requiring quorum and 7 days' notice for any vote. The room erupted in murmurs as he laid out the rules Patricia had ignored for years. Patricia's face flushed red, her composure cracking as she tried to dismiss him. But then, Helen stood up. She described her bogus fence fines. Marisol followed, detailing years of harassment over her garden. David recounted the basketball citations. Each voice added weight, And soon the meeting transformed into something Patricia had never experienced: open resistance. The proposal collapsed under scrutiny. Patricia banged her gavel, insisting on order, but the damage was done. Residents who had once feared her were now questioning her legitimacy. That night, Patricia paced her driveway, phone in hand, gesturing wildly as she made call after call. Michael's cameras captured every second. She was unraveling, and everyone could see it. But Michael also knew a desperate opponent was the most dangerous kind. Patricia had too much to lose, financially, socially, and legally. Exposure would mean ruin, and she would fight tooth and nail to avoid it. As the coalition gathered once more in Michael's garage, the mood was no longer defensive. It was determined. They weren't just protecting themselves from Patricia's harassment anymore. They were preparing to bring her down completely. The plan was simple: build an airtight case, one so strong that neither Patricia nor her allies could deny it. Document everything, expose her finances, and when the time was right, deliver the evidence to the authorities. For years, Patricia had controlled Willow Creek Estates through fear and paperwork. But now, the residents had their own arsenal: evidence, unity, and the will to fight back. The tide had turned, and Patricia Lane was about to learn what it felt like to be outnumbered in the kingdom she once ruled without question. The coalition had spent weeks gathering evidence, and Michael knew they finally had enough to move from defense to offense. It was no longer about fending off Patricia's harassment. It was about dismantling her entire empire of intimidation. The garage, once Michael's quiet workshop, had transformed into something resembling a war room. Tables were lined with binders, folders, and timelines. Color-coded charts showed patterns of violations that coincided with property sales. Financial statements were stacked in neat piles, their numbers circled in red ink. Every citation, every complaint, every dollar siphoned from HOA dues had been traced and catalogued. At the head of it all stood Michael, not as a soldier this time, but as a strategist. His calm voice guided the group, his patience steadying them when emotions threatened to spill over. Patricia had fractured the neighborhood for years, but now, her victims were uniting under a single purpose: accountability. The first move was simple but devastating. Sarah, a forensic accountant who had joined the coalition after reviewing her own inflated HOA dues, conducted a full audit of the HOA's financials. What she uncovered was staggering: over $80,000 in unexplained expenses funneled into companies linked to Patricia. Landscaping firms that never completed work. Consulting services that produced no reports. Legal fees paid to her personal attorney. The trail was so blatant it read less like clever fraud and more like arrogance. The second move came from Tom, a postal worker with a knack for record-keeping. He had traced the property sales Patricia had influenced. 3 families in the last 2 years had been fined and harassed until they sold. Each home was purchased at a fraction of its value. And each sale, without fail, had been brokered by Patricia's cousin. The double commission, combined with the depressed value, created a financial motive too strong to ignore. The coalition now had motive, method, and evidence. All that remained was timing. Patricia, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued her campaign of harassment. More violation notices appeared in mailboxes. More baseless accusations circulated online. She even escalated her rhetoric at HOA meetings, portraying Michael and his coalition as agitators trying to destroy the neighborhood. But each outburst only weakened her. Residents who once nodded along now rolled their eyes. Her credibility was cracking in public view. The coalition's next step was outreach. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, not emotional pleas, but factual summaries. They outlined financial discrepancies, patterns of harassment, and the evidence of Patricia's real estate manipulation. Every claim was backed with documents. The tone was calm, professional, and impossible to dismiss as rumor. The effect was immediate. Residents who had stayed neutral began attending meetings. Questions Patricia once brushed aside now came from every corner of the room. When she attempted to silence critics with her gavel, murmurs of disapproval filled the air. For the first time in years, Patricia's authority was not absolute. Still, Patricia fought back. Anonymous threats resurfaced. Letters slipped into mailboxes warning residents to choose the right side. A fresh wave of roofing nails appeared in Michael's driveway, but his cameras caught the act from multiple angles. The police added it to her growing case file. Michael, meanwhile, kept the coalition focused. Every provocation was met with documentation. Every threat was recorded, catalogued, and added to the expanding archive. Patricia's desperation was working against her, piling evidence higher with each reckless move. Then came the turning point: Patricia's own finances. Marisol, who worked part-time at the county clerk's office, discovered public foreclosure filings. Patricia's house was weeks away from being seized due to unpaid dues and mounting debts. The revelation sent a ripple through the coalition. Their tormentor, the self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards, was drowning in her own unpaid bills. It explained everything: the desperate fines, the harassment campaigns, the fraudulent schemes. Patricia wasn't just drunk on power. She was cornered, fighting for financial survival. With this knowledge, the coalition accelerated. Michael compiled a full report, hundreds of pages long, complete with photos, video stills, financial statements, and sworn testimonies. The package was submitted to the county prosecutor, the housing authority, and the state's real estate commission. Each agency received a copy, ensuring Patricia couldn't bury the complaint through influence or intimidation. The final step was publicity. Sarah contacted a local investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in suburban communities. The reporter's interest was immediate. HOA fraud was already a hot topic, but this story had everything: embezzlement, harassment, racial undertones, and a neighborhood rising against its tyrant leader. By the time the journalist scheduled interviews, Patricia's kingdom was collapsing in real time. Neighbors once too scared to speak now stood in front yards, openly discussing their grievances. HOA meetings turned hostile, not toward Michael, but toward Patricia. And the board members who once supported her began distancing themselves, quietly fearful of legal exposure. Still, Patricia refused to surrender. At one meeting, she called the coalition domestic terrorists and threatened lawsuits against anyone who questioned her authority. But the words rang hollow, drowned out by the collective anger of residents who had finally found their voices. The war had shifted completely. Patricia was no longer the predator. She was the cornered animal, lashing out in desperation while her enemies closed in from every direction. Michael knew the end was near. He didn't celebrate, didn't boast. He simply kept documenting, filing, and preparing. The coalition wasn't after revenge, they were after justice. And justice, he knew, was closing in like a storm. The neighborhood had waited years for someone to challenge Patricia Lane, but when her downfall finally began, it moved faster than anyone expected. What had once been whispers in garages and quiet exchanges over hedges had become something undeniable, a tidal wave of evidence that was too big to ignore. The first blow landed with law enforcement. Detective Harris from the county's Financial Crimes Unit visited Michael's garage one Friday afternoon. He wasn't there on a courtesy call. He had received the coalition's thick report, and he wanted to see the operation for himself. The detective flipped through the binders, the charts, and the timestamps with the practiced eye of a man who had seen dozens of fraud cases. By the end of his review, he said little, but the weight of his nod told Michael everything. Patricia was in serious trouble. The second blow came through the media. Just a week later, a local news van parked at the entrance of Willow Creek Estates. The investigative journalist, a woman with a reputation for sharp reporting, walked the sidewalks with her crew, interviewing residents one by one. Neighbors who once trembled at Patricia's name now spoke freely on camera. They described years of harassment, unjust fines, and the mysterious property sales that always benefited Patricia's cousin. Their voices carried the bitterness of long-suppressed frustration. That evening, the segment aired on the 6 o'clock news. The headline blazed across the screen: HOA president accused of harassment and fraud, residents fight back. The story spread online within hours, drawing comments from viewers who shared their own HOA horror stories. What had begun as a neighborhood dispute had become part of a larger, national conversation about abuse of power in homeowners associations. Patricia's response was predictable: denial. She called an emergency HOA meeting, attempting to paint herself as the victim of a smear campaign. She claimed Michael and the coalition were conspiring to destroy her reputation. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. They had seen the evidence, watched the news coverage, and heard their own neighbors speak with trembling honesty. Patricia's words bounced off the walls like echoes in an empty room. Behind the scenes, the consequences were mounting. The county prosecutor opened an official investigation into HOA finances. Subpoenas were issued for bank records, payment histories, and Patricia's personal accounts. The state's real estate commission also launched an inquiry, questioning how so many sales had been funneled through her cousin's office under suspicious circumstances. Each day brought fresh signs of Patricia's unraveling. Her once pristine lawn began to show neglect, weeds sprouting through cracks in the pavement. Her white SUV, once polished to a shine, sat dusty in the driveway. Neighbors reported hearing late-night shouting matches from inside her house, as though the walls themselves were straining under the pressure. And then came the foreclosure notice. It spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Patricia's own home was set for auction in less than a month. The woman who fined others for chipped paint and uneven lawns couldn't keep up with her own debts. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Michael, though, remained steady. He knew better than to assume victory too soon. Patricia was cornered, and cornered people made reckless moves. His camera stayed on, his files updated, and his coalition alert. If Patricia attempted another act of sabotage, they would be ready. Sure enough, she tried. One night, Michael's security system caught her creeping along his property line, carrying containers of motor oil. She scattered them near his garage, an obvious attempt to frame him for environmental violations. What she didn't realize was that the cameras captured her every move. Her face, her license plate, even the Home Depot stickers still stuck to the oil containers. The next morning, a city inspector arrived after an anonymous complaint. But when Michael showed him the footage, the inspector's patience snapped. Filing false environmental claims was a serious offense, and Patricia's name was added to yet another report. Her tactics were failing, her influence collapsing, and her reputation ruined. Still, she clung to her delusions. On social media, she posted long, rambling rants about outsiders destroying community values. She accused the coalition of being criminals, anarchists, even terrorists. But the more she posted, the clearer her desperation became. Neighbors stopped responding altogether, leaving her to shout into a digital void. The final blow of the chapter came with her arrest. It wasn't dramatic at first, just two plainclothes detectives arriving at her door with a warrant. But when the news vans rolled up minutes later, the neighborhood erupted. Residents stood on sidewalks, some whispering, others openly cheering as Patricia was led to a waiting cruiser. The woman who had ruled with an iron clipboard was now just another suspect in handcuffs, her empire crumbling around her. Still, Michael knew this was only the beginning of the end. Investigations took time, and Patricia wasn't done lashing out. There would be hearings, depositions, and courtroom drama ahead. But the battle had shifted irrevocably. For the first time in years, Willow Creek Estates wasn't living under Patricia's shadow. They were watching it fade. The sight of Patricia in handcuffs had electrified Willow Creek Estates, but it was only the beginning. Arrests made headlines, but convictions required patience, evidence, and persistence. Michael and the coalition knew they couldn't afford to relax. Their work wasn't finished until Patricia was stripped of her power completely. The weeks leading up to her hearing were filled with tension. Detectives came and went, gathering financial records, interviewing neighbors, and piecing together the timeline of Patricia's scheme. The coalition's files, carefully curated and indexed by Michael and Sarah, became the backbone of the investigation. Detectives openly admitted that without the neighborhood's documentation, the case might have remained a collection of suspicions. Meanwhile, Patricia attempted to claw her way back into relevance. From the confines of her legal battles, she flooded social media with claims of being a victim. She painted herself as a martyr for community standards, insisting that she was targeted by outsiders who never understood what Willow Creek Estate stood for. But her words carried no weight anymore. Every neighbor had lived through her harassment. No amount of spin could erase years of fear and fines. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with energy. Residents filled the benches, their faces a mixture of anticipation and vindication. Reporters lined the hallways, eager to capture every detail of the scandal that had grown into a statewide story. Patricia entered in a dark suit, her once perfect posture sagging, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Gone was the clipboard-wielding queen of the cul-de-sac. In her place stood a woman cornered by her own greed. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. They presented the forged violation letters, the fraudulent invoices, the unexplained withdrawals from HOA accounts. They showed the timeline of property sales, each one linked to Patricia's cousin's real estate firm. And then, with devastating clarity, they played the security footage. Patricia scattering nails across Michael's driveway, sloshing oil near his garage, creeping at night with the desperation of someone trying to rewrite reality. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that the coalition had framed her, but the sheer weight of documentation crushed every attempt. The prosecutor's refrain echoed through the courtroom, "These are not accusations. These are facts." Neighbors took the stand one by one. Helen spoke of her fabricated fence violations. David described his children's basketball games targeted as noise disturbances. Marisol recounted the endless harassment over her flower garden. Each testimony painted a portrait of a woman who had weaponized authority not for community betterment, but for personal gain. Michael's turn came last. He walked to the witness stand with the calm steadiness that had carried him through every battle, foreign and domestic. His words were measured, his tone even. He described the endless stream of violations, the threats, the vandalism, and finally, the coalition's decision to unite. He didn't grandstand, didn't raise his voice. He simply told the truth, and the truth was damning enough. By the time he stepped down, the weight of Patricia's empire had been laid bare for the court to see. The defense scrambled, grasping at excuses. Patricia's attorney claimed she suffered from stress, that she had been overworked and misunderstood. They painted her as a woman who only wanted to preserve property values. But the evidence shredded every plea. Stress didn't explain forged documents. Misunderstanding didn't justify siphoning thousands of dollars into fake companies. And no amount of spin could erase the videos of her committing acts of vandalism in the dead of night. The judge listened patiently, her expression unreadable until the final arguments concluded. Then, with the clarity of a gavel striking wood, she announced that Patricia would stand trial on charges of fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and filing false reports. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but among the residents of Willow Creek Estates, the reaction wasn't surprise. It was relief. Years of torment were finally being dragged into the light, and justice was no longer a distant hope, it was imminent. Patricia, however, still clung to denial. As deputies escorted her out, she turned toward the gallery, her eyes blazing with venom. She mouthed words only Michael caught, "This isn't over." But for once, Patricia's threats rang hollow. The coalition had stripped away her power. The legal system was grinding into motion, and her empire of fear was collapsing under its own weight. Back in Willow Creek, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt lighter, conversations freer. Neighbors waved at each other without glancing over their shoulders. Children played basketball in David's driveway again, their laughter echoing down streets that had been silent for too long. The community, scarred but unbroken, was learning how to breathe again. Michael knew there was still a final chapter to be written. Trials took time, and Patricia wasn't finished fighting. But the outcome no longer felt uncertain. The truth was too strong, the unity too solid, the evidence too overwhelming. The woman who once ruled with a clipboard now faced the judgment of the very people she had terrorized. And as the neighborhood gathered in living rooms, garages, and coffee shops, they began planning not just for Patricia's downfall, but for what came after, an HOA that served the residents instead of exploiting them. For the first time in years, the future looked bright. The trial of Patricia Lane stretched on for months, each hearing peeling back another layer of her empire of deceit. The evidence was relentless. Bank statements, fraudulent invoices, and hours of damning video footage painted a portrait of a woman who had abused her authority with precision and greed. What had once been whispers in the neighborhood had now become official record in a court of law. Reporters covered every detail. Headlines screamed about the HOA president from hell and fraud in Willow Creek Estates. Patricia, once obsessed with the neighborhood's reputation, had become its greatest embarrassment. And with each article, each televised segment, her carefully constructed image crumbled further. The residents who had suffered under her reign stood together in solidarity. Helen, David, Marisol, and dozens of others testified courageously, their voices steady as they recounted years of harassment. Their unity became the most powerful evidence of all, proof that Patricia hadn't been a misunderstood enforcer of rules, but a predator who thrived on fear. Michael remained at the center, not as a hero basking in glory, but as a steady anchor holding the coalition together. He coordinated with prosecutors, ensured documents were delivered on time, and reminded his neighbors that their fight wasn't just about one woman. It was about reclaiming their dignity, their peace, and their community. The verdict finally came on a crisp autumn afternoon. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled with residents who had lived through Patricia's tyranny. The judge's words fell heavy and final, guilty on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and filing false reports. Patricia's face, once so composed and commanding, collapsed into a mask of disbelief. Her attorney's hand on her shoulder did little to steady her as the sentence was read: 5 years in prison, restitution payments to the HOA, and a permanent ban from holding any position of authority in homeowners associations or real estate. Gasps filled the room, followed by quiet tears and embraces. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was relief, the kind that comes after years of suffocating tension finally lift. When Patricia was let out in cuffs for the last time, no one cheered. They didn't need to. Justice had spoken louder than any applause could. Back in Willow Creek Estates, change began immediately. The coalition transitioned from a resistance into a leadership team. Elections were held for a new board, this time filled with residents committed to fairness and transparency. The bylaws, once weapons in Patricia's hands, were reviewed and rewritten to protect homeowners instead of punish them. Cameras once installed for defense now became tools for accountability and safety. The atmosphere shifted. Children played freely without parents fearing fines. Yards bloomed with gardens that reflected each homeowner's individuality. Driveways filled with laughter and cookouts instead of silent resentment. The neighborhood began to feel like a community again. Michael, though, never sought recognition. He returned to his quiet life, tending his tomato garden and tinkering with his motorcycles in the garage. Neighbors waved warmly, often stopping to thank him, but he brushed it off with a modest smile. He hadn't fought Patricia for praise. He had fought for peace. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across Willow Creek Estates, Michael sat on his porch and reflected. He thought about the journey, the first violation notice, the endless harassment, the coalition that had risen from the ashes of fear. He thought about how close Patricia had come to crushing him, and how instead, she had forged a unity the neighborhood had never known before. In the end, Patricia's downfall wasn't just about exposing fraud. It was about restoring hope. Willow Creek Estates had learned that power only thrived when people stayed silent. And once they found their voices, even the strongest tyrant couldn't withstand the truth. Michael leaned back, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. For the first time since moving into the cul-de-sac, he felt the peace he had been searching for all along. Not the fragile peace of avoiding conflict, but the real peace that came from justice served and a community healed. And as the porch light flicked on, illuminating the flag he proudly flew, Michael knew that Willow Creek's story wasn't one of oppression anymore. It was a story of resilience, courage, and neighbors who refused to be broken. The war was over. The neighborhood was free.